So to start off, so like I said, I rearranged some of these slides, so you may have to flip back and forth a bit. So we know that cells need energy to stay alive. So what do they actually need that energy for? Well, lots of different things. Three main categories are one, mechanical work. So to move things around in the cell. You remember we saw that motor protein when we saw that video at the beginning, that thing walking along the microtubule, pulling a vacuole over that. That takes energy for that to take place. So moving things around, structures within the cell. To transport things across the membrane against the concentration gradient, that takes energy in active transport. Chemical reactions often require energy in order to work. So that's why cells need energy. And the main form that that energy takes that cells can use most readily is ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It's what powers most of the work the cell does. Yes. Yes. Okay. So ATP is what powers the cell's work, and you can think of it as sort of a charged battery. It's got 3 of these phosphate groups bonded to it, and when the energy from this ATP molecule is used, what does it become? ATP plus a phosphate that's been broken off. So when this phosphate gets broken off, that releases some energy that the cell can actually use to do something. And so then after the energy's been used, now it's ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus this organic phosphate. And these two things can be recombined, and the battery can be recharged. And that process is how materials, or how energy gets transformed from one form to another. Those bonds between the phosphates, that's what stores the energy. Does this happen in cells? Happens in, basically all cells. So here's just another diagram that shows the 3 types of work that cells need ATP for: moving things, structures within the cell, transporting molecules, and also for specific chemical reactions. So we're going to talk about the source of that ATP, the main source, and that's respiration. There's actually 2 types of respiration that we're going to talk about. But respiration transfers energy that's stored in the bonds of glucose into energy stored in the bonds of ATP. It's just transforming energy. Really, it's not accurate scientifically to say energy is made or produced or created. What you really should say is transformed or released. Because in physics, energy and matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can be transformed from one form to another. And that's what's happening. The glucose molecule contains energy. That energy is being transformed into energy in ATP, which can be used to do work in the cell. And so respiration works through a series of reactions, step by step, each of them controlled by an enzyme, and sort of along the way, small amounts of energy are released. And there's 2 big groups of respiration, 2 categories: aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. You know the difference between those 2? What is aerobic exercise? Yes, and when you're doing aerobic exercise, you're using a lot of what? Oxygen. Aerobic respiration, uses oxygen. Anaerobic respiration does not. So we'll talk about both. We'll start with anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is respiration that doesn't use oxygen. So sometimes this happens just when oxygen isn't available. Some organisms can switch from what they typically do, aerobic respiration, to anaerobic, if there's no oxygen available. Also, certain organisms don't have the enzymes for aerobic respiration, so they rely solely on anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration takes place in the cytoplasm, and it starts with a process called glycolysis. Glycolysis involves a molecule of glucose being split, being oxidized into two molecules of something called pyruvate. It takes two ATP molecules to start this process, but the end result is it releases 4 molecules of ATP. So this has a net gain of 2. So you put in 2, but you got 4 back, so you net gain 2 ATP, so you release ATP. So that's anaerobic respiration. Now, that pyruvate, what happens to it varies with different organisms. In some organisms, the pyruvate gets converted into ethanol, which is alcohol, and carbon dioxide. And we rely on this principle to make beer, wine, and bread. Those products are produced because yeast, some bacteria, consume the glucose in the bread, for example. Starches in the bread are broken down. They use that energy, and the end product is carbon dioxide, which causes the bread dough to rise. Or if it's done with grape juice, okay, or malted barley, then as yeast in the malted barley solution or in the grape juice, consume the sugar, produce alcohol and carbon dioxide, and that's where wine and beer come from. So they're the products of what we call fermentation. Other organisms take the pyruvate and instead it's reduced into lactic acid. This happens in our bodies. So when our muscles have been working very hard, using lots of ATP, and consuming a lot of oxygen, if our muscles run out of oxygen, our body's not able to supply them with enough oxygen, they can switch. Our muscle cells can switch to anaerobic respiration. Okay, because they don't have oxygen, so they still get ATP, but the end product of this is lactic acid. The lactic acid in our muscles causes our muscles to burn, causes muscle fatigue, causes you to be sore the next day. So that's because our muscles are switching to this lactic acid fermentation. Also, certain types of bacteria do this. That's what's used to make yogurt and different types of cheeses. So fermentation takes the pyruvic acid and then might produce lactic acid. There's several other types of fermentation as well, but the most common ones that we'll talk about are lactic acid. And here's an example of some products that are made using different types of fermentation. So again, you see at the top, starting with glucose, these go through anaerobic respiration, they go through glycolysis to produce pyruvic acid or pyruvate, which then, depending on the organism, can be further changed into acetic acid, for example, to make vinegar, acetone, making nail polish, alcohol and CO2 in beer and wine, lactic acid, making some cheeses and yogurt, propionic acid and CO2 to make Swiss cheese. So we've found uses for lots of these types of fermentation. All right, but we're going to talk mostly about aerobic respiration, cellular respiration that uses oxygen. So aerobic respiration produces much more ATP than anaerobic respiration. How much was produced in anaerobic? How many molecules of ATP? How many net? 2. Aerobic respiration, starting with the same 1 molecule of glucose, produces 36 or so ATP. So quite a difference. You have much more ATP through aerobic respiration. It actually starts off the same way as anaerobic respiration, with glycolysis in the cytoplasm. So we start up here. This is glycolysis. Happens in the cytoplasm. It starts with glucose, forms 2 pyruvate molecules, and results in a net gain of 2 ATP. But then in aerobic respiration, those pyruvate molecules continue on a different pathway, where the rest of the energy is extracted from. So from glycolysis, those pyruvate molecules go into a cycle called the Kreb cycle. From there, electrons from the Kreb cycle are sort of harvested and sent to the electron transport chain, which generates the rest of the. So in 7th grade, you learned this equation for cellular respiration. And it's not wrong. Glucose plus oxygen produces ATP, water, and oxygen. And carbon dioxide, that should be not oxygen. But again, as with photosynthesis, this year you're going to learn a little bit about the details about how that actually happens. So what's the organelle where this is taking place? In the mitochondria. So glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. The rest of the process happens in the mitochondria. The mitochondria in these folds has enzymes and molecules that allow this process to take place. Other parts happen inside of the matrix of the mitochondria. And it's actually similar in some ways to photosynthesis. So the overview is we have glucose comes in, broken up by glycolysis into 2 pyruvates, which go through the Krebs cycle, which harvests electrons that get sent to the electron transport chain. Where else have we seen electron transport chain? Photosynthesis. Right? The electron transport chain works in basically the same way. So here you see another view. Glucose, glycolysis produces some ATP, but also some NADH. Does that look familiar? It's similar to what? NADPH. What do you think it is? Or does? Same thing, FADH2 is a similar type of molecule. What do those molecules do? What was their purpose in photosynthesis? They're energy carriers. They carry electrons from one part to another. So it produces NADH. Here, as the pyruvate's broken down, more NADH and some carbon dioxide. Right? More carbon dioxide, more NADH. These molecules are carrying electrons to the final step, which is the electron transport chain. And that's where most of the ATP is going to come from. Okay, so glycolysis, Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and on to the electron transport chain. So we look at where the ATP comes from. You get 2 from glycolysis, 2 from the Krebs cycle, and then 32 come from this electron transport chain. So let's look at the pieces individually. The Krebs cycle goes around twice for every glucose. How many carbons in a glucose molecule? 6. When it gets split into 2 pyruvates, how many in each molecule? 3. That's this 3 carbon sugar here. gets transformed into a 2-carbon sugar, or 2-carbon molecule, which gets combined with a 4-carbon molecule in the cycle, which forms a 6 and a 5 and a 4, and this process repeats over and over again. Along the way, we release some carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is just a waste gas. But we're getting out of it some ATP, but also some of these energy-carrying molecules, NADH and FADH2. So that pyruvic acid produces ATP, FADH2, NADH, and CO2.
Respiration, how do you get the pyruvic acid?
Because the first part of the process is the same. So both in aerobic and anaerobic, it starts as glucose, and then glycolysis breaks it into 2 pyruvates. And so those pyruvates are what's coming in here. So in anaerobic respiration, this doesn't happen. Okay? The pyruvic acid is changed into other products. Here's what a little bit more detailed view looks like. So again, pyruvates coming in. You don't need to know these details. Okay, but what you'll see is that it's a series of steps that gradually modify and oxidize these molecules. Okay, and you have citrate, isocitrate, ketoglutarate, succinyl, succinate, fumarate, malate, oxalacetate. And between each of these compounds, there's an enzyme that's written in red that regulates it. So when we talked about enzymes and proteins, we talked about how important they are to organisms. That's because every step along the way, there's an enzyme that's allowing these reactions to take place. So the Kreb cycle produced NADH and FADH2. They are being sent over to the electron transport chain. Electron transport chain forms 32 ATP molecules by a series of redox reactions. NADH and FADH2 get oxidized, and the electrons are used to produce ATP. Molecules of the electron transport chain, they're embedded in the membrane of the folds of the mitochondria, the crisps they're called. And this electron transport chain works just like the electron transport chain in photosynthesis. Molecules are different, but the concept's the same. So I'll show you this diagram here. So here we have the inner parts of the mitochondria. So again, what we see is the NADH, the FADH2, which came from the other parts of respiration. They give up their electron. Those electrons get passed from one molecule to another, to another, to another. And as they're passed, that energy is being used to pump protons across the membrane. Hydrogen ions here, protons, are building up over here. And what's going to happen to them? Same thing that happened in photosynthesis. You build up the protons on one side, and what happens? What's that? What happens to those hydrogen ions after you build them up on one side?
When they go through the ATP synthesis.
Making ATP. So you're building up protons on this side, eventually they come back through, ATP synthase, just like in photosynthesis. And that's what generates the ATP that's coming from the electron transport chain. Okay.
Is all of the blue the electron?
Yep, those are the molecules in the electron transport chain. And after this electron goes through the electron, it has to go somewhere. If it stopped, if it couldn't go anywhere, this process would back up. So the final molecule that accepts this electron once it's gone through the electron transport chain is oxygen. This is why respiration needs oxygen. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor. It takes this electron along with a proton and produces water. And that's why water is an end product. So NADH and FADH2 are oxidized, pumping protons across the membrane. As those protons are pulled back through, ATP synthase by oxygen, okay, ADP is converted to ATP, and oxygen is the final electron acceptor. Here's just another view. Glycolysis happens out here. This is the cytoplasm. Came in and provided some NADH. The pyruvate goes through the Kreb cycle, producing a couple ATP and carbon dioxide, and a bunch of FADH2 and NADH. Those go over to the electron transport chain. Those electrons go through it, pumping protons out until they come back through ATP synthase, generating 32 ATPs and producing water after the oxygen bonds with that electron. Let me go back here a second. What do you think is going to happen to after the NADH gives up its electrons and FADH2 gives up the electrons in the hydrogen? What do you think is going to happen to these things? To do what? Exactly. So after NADH gives up its hydrogen and electrons, now it's NADH, it can be recharged, just like in photosynthesis. So after they are oxidized, they can come back to the Krebs cycle or other parts to be reduced again. And so these molecules are just basically shuttling electrons back and forth between the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And that this process, the electron transport chain's ability to generate ATP, is called oxidative phosphorylation. It's adding that phosphate group to ATP through redox reaction. So we see again in this overview our basic formula for aerobic cellular respiration. Glucose plus oxygen produce ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. What we just talked about is sort of the details of what's going on inside of the cell, inside of the mitochondria, to allow that to happen. Any questions? Okay.